Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Macdonald-Laurier Institute webinar on the topic of COVID-19 vaccines and whether or not an intellectual property or patent waiver will help increase access and production of these crucial vaccines. My name is Philip Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of Geneva Network, which is a UK-based think tank focusing on innovation, trade, and development policy. I'm doing hosting duties for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute today, where we're joined by an expert panel of four eminent speakers, where we'll be discussing this issue. But first of all, for those who are not following this issue in great depth, let me give you a bit of introduction to the topic. A proposal was put before the World Trade Organization in Geneva late last year by South Africa and India, which has been backed by a coalition of mainly developing countries. The idea is to boost COVID vaccine and treatment manufacturing capacity by freeing rival vaccine manufacturers from the intellectual property constraints that may prevent them from making extra doses of these proprietary vaccines. And currently, the membership of the World Trade Organization is somewhat split on the issue. The United States has given tentative and somewhat limited support for this waiver, which is quite surprising given that the US is normally a very strong backer of intellectual property rights and the global IP system. The United Kingdom, where I come from, Japan and the European Union remain opposed, with the EU putting forward a counter proposal, which it says will solve the issue more effectively. And many other countries, including, I believe, Canada, have not yet declared their support or opposition for this waiver at the World Trade Organization, and waiting to see how the debate unfolds over the next few months. And hopefully there'll be a resolution either next month or in November. So this debate and this webinar comes at a very timely moment in the global debate. Let me just outline the key arguments for and against this waiver before we get into the moderated panel. So why do this waiver? Developing countries do not have access to sufficient supplies of COVID vaccines, some say, and the hoarding of intellectual property rights means there is plenty of vaccine manufacturing capacity that could address the problem standing idle. And if they have access to IP, they can start making the vaccines and bring the pandemic to an end more quickly. Against, which I'm sure we'll hear in a bit more detail in a moment, because the technologies involved in manufacturing these vaccines are so new and technologically advanced, it'll be impossible for manufacturers to copy these vaccines without direct cooperation and voluntary transfer of technology from the innovative companies. And it's difficult to see that happening even with an IP waiver of the kind suggested at the WTO. And at any rate, voluntary cooperation and knowledge sharing is already happening on a global scale, and this cooperation depends on intellectual property rights. So those are the basic contours of the debate. Let me introduce you to our panelists now, and let's get started with the conversation. We have David Kapos, former Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. David, nice to have you with us. We have Mark Agnew, Senior Vice President, Policy and Government Relations at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Good morning, Mark. We have Mark Shultz, who's the Director of Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron School of Law and also a Senior Fellow at the Geneva Network. Good morning, Mark. We have Christina Ackery, who's Professor of Economics and Business at Colorado College and a researcher and writer on pharmaceutical economics and other health economic questions. Well, welcome to you all and thank you for joining us. Let's dive straight into the main issues. We'll start with Dave Kapos, this one to you. So I think this question goes to the heart of the issue. Many proponents of the waiver have argued that given that government funding has played quite a key role in the development of some of these vaccines that are being distributed around the world today, the private sector should not have the usual protection of the IP rights they normally enjoy in normal peacetime. And the IP rights should be made freely available to all manufacturers to boost global supply. Do you think that's a legitimate argument?
Yeah, well, first of all, good morning, Philip, and thank you to you and to the Geneva Network for putting this program together. It is really, really important. I appreciate the opportunity to participate. And I'd start by saying, look, the issue of vaccinating the entire planet, that is every person, is a really crucially important issue. I get, and I'm sure the other panelists get and feel passionately that it is our responsibility as humans and people who care about our fellow humans everywhere to do what we can and to support policies that will extend vaccination to everybody, not just rich developed countries, but everybody. So I want to start by just making sure everyone understands, I am fully on board personally with the importance of this issue. And if it were the case that, to come to your question, Philip, if it were the case that the governments had actually funded some enormous percentage or a preponderance of the research that's led to the successful vaccines, it would be an interesting point. My understanding of the funding levels is that while yes, governments and I could particularly talk about the U.S. government has participated in funding some fraction of the initial upstream research that occurred in at least in the mRNA vaccine here in the U.S. It turns out that the lion's share of the funding, and we're talking billions of dollars in order to get these vaccines through FDA approval here in the U.S., has come from the companies themselves, meaning the private sector. And so it's a dramatic leap to say that because the government provided some initial seed funding, that therefore the entire corpus of these vaccines needs to be made free. And that sets aside issues that we'll talk about later involving how vaccines actually make it to the marketplace and the role of the private sector in ways that the government just can't play.
And thank you, Martin. Dave and Mark, the same question to you from a Canadian perspective. I know a lot of the vaccines were developed in Europe and the US in particular, but what are your thoughts on this as a Canadian?
Yeah, well, and let me say, first of all, thank you to you, Philip, and colleagues for organizing this event. And, at the top, I want to, echo this similar sentiment to what, Dave expressed about, the Canadian Chamber as a, organization representing companies that operate all around the world. It's in our, collective interest as a global community, global business community, to make sure that we do get the vaccines deployed to all four corners of the earth. And the way that I think the issue's been positioned around the TRIPS waiver is in many ways kind of that cliche of it's a it's a solution and a problem that are disconnected from each other here, or a solution a problem in search of a solution, I guess. Or maybe I mixed that one around. But anyways, you get what I'm saying. So I think when we talk about the IP sort of framework and what companies look at in their planning cycles, I mean, to David's point, governments played a partial role in de-risking this, but the private sector nonetheless has put up a huge amount of capital, a huge amount of people investment into this in the R&D process to get us to where we are today with these vaccines being developed way ahead of schedule from what was initially predicted at the start of the pandemic. And certainly, I have a list, here on my other screen, enumerating a whole series of partnerships in, multiple regions around the world, whether it's, the vaccine manufacturers that have gone out to their competitors. Some of them have gone to Sanofi, for instance, had a partnership. I know there's relationships that have been had between, Moderna and their counterparts in Saudi Arabia. There's relationships with South Korea and generic manufacturers. So what the IP rights have done is enabled a sort of structured framework within which these partnerships can occur. And I think a point that we'll talk about a bit later on is that the TRIPS mechanism already does have a tool through Article 31 by which we can talk about a sort of predictable and stable way for IP transfers to occur.
Thank you, Mark. And turning to the other Mark, I'm sure a lot of us will remember the debate 20 odd years ago, particularly around HIV drugs in sub-Saharan Africa, when the question of IP came up a lot back then, and it was not too difficult for chemical engineers to reverse engineer the innovative HIV drugs of the time and manufacture them. And now many of the drugs that are available in sub-Saharan Africa are generic, and often made in partnership with the innovator. But the technology was not too advanced. But it seems a bit more different with COVID vaccines. They seem to be a slightly more complex technology. So the question is, are patents the key issue here? If we override patents as per the WTO waiver, is that going to allow people to manufacture them, or are there other forms of intellectual property rights covering these complex technologies which you think might be more relevant?
Sure, thanks, Philip, and I'll echo everybody else. Thanks for holding this, and I'm glad to be here. And I think I'm certainly on. I really want to see vaccines get to everybody, and I think, in fact, we're doing some of the things we need to do that. I hope we can do them faster, and we'll talk about what some of the challenges are later. But the challenge in the biopharma industry now is, or the way the biopharma industry is now, is fundamentally different from how it was a few decades ago. It was the case in the past, to probably oversimplify things, but that we mostly had small molecule drugs, and small molecule drugs can be synthesized using a well-known process and manufactured using a well-known process. And it's what happens in the middle, historically, where a lot of the innovation has been in the drug discovery. And once you've determined the particular formula or recipe for the drug, others, of course, can manufacture it using a well-known process. Today, we rely more on biologics, and that's a good thing, because biologics can do things that small molecule drugs can't. But the challenge with biologics is they are typically made by more complex processes. So examples of biologics include monoclonal antibodies, the viral vector vaccines, and many other important treatments today, and more are coming online every year. And those are often made by a relatively novel process. Parts of that process are well known, but typically each biologic has some elements of novelty in it. And so it's a complex process to even achieve creating the new treatment. For example, we've heard a lot about mRNA vaccines. Well, mRNA vaccines were not something that rely on pre-existing technology. They rely on technology that's been developed over the past decade or more. And as David noted, the U.S. government and other governments may have funded a fraction of the cost of getting mRNA vaccines for COVID deployed. But a good example is of the balance of that funding is that Moderna took in about $6 billion or more worth of private funding over the years to develop its platform. It faced a lot of skepticism and doubt that its technology would ever work. Fortunately, after all that investment and hard work, it was ready when we needed it, when the world needed it a year ago. And then, yes, the U.S. put in nearly $1 billion of funding to help Moderna develop its manufacturing process, but it also constituted a prepayment for the vaccines that have been delivered. So there's tremendous funding that went in before to create a novel process. The novel process was ready, and the vaccines have to be manufactured by a novel process that had never been developed at scale before. And as one pharma manufacturer I talked to likened it to building the plane while they were flying it over the past 18 months. They had never manufactured mRNA vaccines at scale. They had to develop a new process to do so. Now, what protects these processes? Well, it's not a patent on a particular formula. It's the technology platform of mRNA vaccines contains IP from many different parties. They've had to license in patents to develop the mRNA platform. Each company has some trade secrets that protect the mRNA platform. And indeed, the manufacturing process is novel, required billions of investments to build, and also has many novel parts. So we're no longer dealing with a technology that has two important, simple, well-known steps of synthesizing the product and manufacturing the product. Each step is now novel and challenging and requires a lot of investment, and that investment is secured by intellectual property rights, both patents and trade secrets. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. And for those who are interested, Mark has just published quite an interesting briefing paper which examines and documents the role of trade secrets, in particular in innovation and manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines. So the link should appear in the chat box in a minute. Please do click and have a read after the webinar, of course. I don't want to distract you from the conversation. So building on what Mark said, Christina, so it seems that we now have these very complicated and high-tech vaccines, which seem to be concentrated, the knowledge of how to make these vaccines is concentrated in a few companies and a few individuals in a few countries, indeed. Now, proponents of the waiver sort of envisage a world in which there's regional vaccine manufacturing everywhere. So there'll be in sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, et cetera, et cetera. It'd be all over the world. And given that the companies view these trade secrets as quite valuable and something that's quite key to their business models more generally, how could under the waiver, how could the international legal system compel or force these companies to teach other potentially rival companies how to make these vaccines?
Thank you, Philip, and thanks to the Institute and also to the Geneva Network for hosting this event and inviting me to participate. It's a delight to be here. In answer to your question, I don't think that there is a way to compel such sharing of knowledge. When it comes to patents, those are pieces of information that are made publicly available upon their filing, and they're things that others can look up and access. Trade secrets are exactly that. They are secrets. And if you're compelled to reveal them, well, that's the destruction of the secret and the destruction of its value. And I don't think that there is an incentive for any firm to want to do that. And I think that there would be great resistance, possibly legal challenges, to any efforts to force them, compel them to reveal that information. The holders of that information are also in very short supply. There are very few people who have this tacit knowledge and ability to step in and do this. And I don't think that companies would want to send those very valuable and very scarce personnel around the world to share in the making of these vaccines with competitors or parties that they viewed as hostile and destroying their secrets and the value that is embedded within them. I think that's a very important distinction with patents. And to go back to your question that Mark answered about the HIV vaccine, I think that patents were the impetus for the development of HIV treatments, but they also did create some barriers to access. There were pricing issues and manufacturing issues that patents threw up barriers to. That's not the case here. In the case of COVID vaccines, we see that they are priced virtually at cost. And the incentives to innovate that patents provided are not interfering with distribution or manufacturing. There are other issues at play that are very important there.
Thanks, Christina. We'll come on to the logistical challenges of vaccinating the world in a minute. But Mark, as a global trade secret expert, we know you've written a lot on the law as it surrounds this topic. Do you have anything to add to what Christina said about how you actually make this work? How do you get this knowledge from, I don't know, Pfizer to Cipla in India, for example? How does that actually happen if Pfizer's not willing to cooperate?
Well, let's describe the knowledge transfer that has happened. And by the way, in the paper, I document the fact that at least as we were able to find, there were 73 manufacturing agreements, for 41 of them for manufacturing the main components of the vaccine, and then another over 30 more for what's called fill and finish, which is putting the vaccine in vials. Those have occurred all over the globe, and some of those key agreements to manufacture the components of the vaccine, in other words, the real know-how, the most key proprietary knowledge, has been shared with competitors. Merck, Sanofi, and Novartis are working with the main vaccine manufacturers to manufacture their proprietary vaccines. So there is knowledge sharing going on. How is that happening? It's happening through, because of the protection and security that trade secret law provides, that patent law provides, and of course that contracts provide. And when companies have this kind of confidence, they can share knowledge. Now, the Wall Street Journal recently documented Pfizer's process of knowledge sharing. You see, Pfizer has said itself that nobody in the world could have done this task alone. Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, and others have all worked with partners because nobody had enough capacity to start with. So I posted a link in our moderators forum to this Wall Street Journal article. I hope somebody can post it to the main comments as I talk. I think it's really worth reading. But let's think about what is going on here. Pfizer developed a 50,000-step process to manufacture the vaccines. It identified and worked with 86 suppliers around the world. The vaccine required 280 materials in total, 10 to 15 of which are completely novel to the mRNA vaccine. These things had not been manufactured at scale before. They had been manufactured for testing. It's the difference between making something in a test tube and making something in an industrial vat, to oversimplify. There's a huge difference between those two things. So Pfizer had to develop this process. And then it looked for partners. And this is what the Wall Street Journal article documents. Pfizer had to find partners to meet the demand, to meet its commitments to governments. And it's been looking for partners. And when it finds a partner that has the capability to both the potential technical capability to manufacture these vaccines, and also to meet the stringent regulatory requirements and the quality controls we all want, they begin to work with them. And so in the process of working with a company called Thermo Fisher and bringing a plant online in Italy, Pfizer transferred more than 500 top secret files containing at least 5,000 pages of documents on making the vaccine. This was a 7-month process, and the parties are still working together to complete the process of submitting data to regulators for approval for Thermo Fisher to begin manufacturing. They have a 24-person team that's been working that entire time with Thermo Fisher to teach them how to make the vaccine and get the plant up and running. So that's for manufacturing. Even just to put the manufactured vaccine into vials and cap them and label them for regulatory requirements. This is called the fill and finish process. The Wall Street Journal also reported that just transferring that knowledge alone of filling and capping the vials typically takes about 18 months and involves 10 stages, each consisting of hundreds of steps during which dozens of things can go wrong. So just to answer the main question, how can companies be forced to transfer this kind of knowledge? Well, I guess I'd have to say good luck with that. Because it's hard to imagine that happening involuntarily. Yes, governments use force to make people to do things, but this is not a simple recipe. This is not a textbook. I guess it's like the difference between taking, a young person who hasn't gone to university yet and handing them the textbooks and saying, go become an engineer and build me something, versus years of teaching and hands-on learning. And for these vaccines, this kind of process requires that kind of voluntary, cooperative, back and forth, hand in hand, working together. And so force or coercion or arm twisting really is unlikely to make this happen. And then, of course, let's keep in mind that Pfizer, we want Pfizer to be focused on the main task. And they only have limited resources and limited numbers of people. And it appears that Pfizer, at least Pfizer and many other companies, though, are working as hard as they can to find partners who can meet the demand and transfer the knowledge. So I think understanding those facts on the ground is important to realize that this is not some simple process of making people give up the knowledge they're allegedly hoarding, which they're actually sharing widely throughout the world, even with competitors.
Thanks, Mark. And Dave, I'll quickly put the same to you. Following your government service, you now practice law and advise companies large and small. What are the sort of legal hurdles you could see, speaking in sort of layman's terms, for making this waiver work in practical terms?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. And first, thanks to Mark. That was a tour de force explanation of why, it's basically impossible to force tech transfer at this level. I'm not aware that it's ever been attempted. I do not believe that the US government has ever attempted to compel scientists to conduct a tech transfer. I mean, imagine literally going to people's homes and apartments and performing some kind of extraordinary rendition, literally apprehending them and then putting them on airplanes and forcing them to go overseas. I mean, it's just unthinkable. It's never happened to my knowledge. And I don't see where it could in any form here. So, my experience in advising the process of transferring technology is entirely voluntary. It's entirely an animal of contract and goodwill between two parties, or in this case, even more than two parties. It happens all the time, by the way, as Mark pointed out, and it's happening in this case. So there's tremendous precedent for it, but never forced precedent.
I think you're on mute, Philip.
Thank you. Schoolboy error. Zooming out a bit, I'll turning to Mark Agnew, who's we've not heard from for a little bit. What do you think the impact of removing IP rights as envisaged by the WTO waiver? What would that mean for existing COVID manufacturing, vaccine manufacturing, B, future COVID vaccine manufacturing, and C, what it might mean for research and development for future pandemics which have yet to occur?
Yeah. So just kind of go through those in order. In terms of the current manufacturing process, this kind of speaks actually to what Mark Shultz was saying in terms of the folks at Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca and J&J. They're running full tilt right now, and there's a huge quality assurance element to all of this. I mean, no one wants a bad batch leaving a factory, let alone being injected into people's arms. And so if we're going out and you're forcing people to be sharing technology and sharing secrets, you're stretching people thin. And I think there was a very real risk, and I don't think I'm being alarmist in saying this, that quality assurance issues could very well come into play. So I think that's, for the current manufacturing, is one consideration. For the future manufacturing, right now we're in a stage where we're trying to get approvals for vaccines for children under the age of 12. These are going to require all sorts of clinical tests, making sure that they're safe for minors. And then at the same time, we're also talking about ensuring that we're adapting the mRNA technology for new variants as they emerge. And if we start having the sort of IP system upended, it's going to create sort of all sorts of disruption for the development that still does need to occur, because the mRNA vaccines, it's not a sort of binary, you did a one and done and then that's going to be the only version we have going forward. There's ongoing testing that's needed and adaptation. And then I think for future R&D and life science biomanufacturing production. When we talk about the TRIPS waiver, I mean, let's talk about the TRIPS waiver proposal that's currently on the table from India, South Africa, and others, and that's it's a very broad sweeping proposal. It's not just actually vaccines. There's other elements that are put in there, and so I think it's fair to say that the proposal is more or less kind of taking a wrecking ball approach. It's not even necessarily a tactical or surgical strike that they're looking at with this, and so I think there's a very legitimate question as to what sort of future signals would this send to the market and to the companies that have to do the innovation at the end of the day if it were to be passed in its current form, certainly.
Same question to Christina. What will this do to the existing manufacturing deals that already exist? As Mark's outlined, there's tons and tons of cooperation in the supply chain amongst dozens of different companies to make these vaccines all over the world. And how would it impact future manufacturing, and what would it do to the interest of the private sector in getting involved in pandemic research in the first place?
I think that this is exactly the thing that we don't want to see, that this would completely unravel the cooperation and collaboration that has brought us the vaccine as quickly as it has. Vaccine development, as well as all biopharmaceutical development, requires a tremendous amount of money, of time, and of expertise. And all of those things are risky. And to get the investment and be incentivized to develop these things is a difficult process. And we want to make sure that the parts of the puzzle that make this investment worthwhile remain in place. So if we dismantle the architecture that protects these intellectual property rights, then we've introduced a tremendous amount of risk and a tremendous amount of uncertainty into the process. I would not collaborate with you if I was afraid that my IP was at risk and you were going to steal it and start doing things behind my back after we were done working together. Currently, patents and other forms of IP protect that knowledge and make sure that you and I can collaborate, that I can trust that my investments in IP are safe, and we can move forward together. If those safeguards are removed, then I'm not going to want to work with you now or want to work with anyone going forward. Moreover, I'm going to have tremendous difficulty attracting investment if I can't protect that investment, protect the knowledge that's generated, and give assurances that there are mechanisms in place that will allow me to capitalize on that investment in the future. Then there's no reason for me to do it. I'm not going to risk my money, my time, the expertise and talent of the people that I work with, and there will be no vaccines for future pandemics. Everything is upended when we waive patent rights.
Let's playing devil's advocate for a minute. Okay, the future is one thing, but what about now? We're in the middle of a global health emergency. Surely we should do anything possible to get more doses in arms. Why not? Surely it wouldn't affect the current manufacturing that's going on if patent rights and other IP rights were waived. It just add to the pool of companies making these vaccines. Do you agree with that or disagree?
I disagree with that. I think it goes back to Mark's brilliant description of the trade secrets that are in place. And we have manufacturing that is taking place now because we have those trade secrets in place. And if we dismantle the IP infrastructure that is in place for us, then current vaccine production will be diminished. In addition, it's not the patents, it's not the trade secrets that are the real impediments to getting shots in arms. We're having a shortage of raw ingredients. We have trouble finding trained personnel. We need refrigeration to deliver these things to many parts of the world. All of those are barriers to getting shots in arms that I think at this moment are more significant and would not be addressed at all by waiving the patent rights.
Okay, thanks, Christina. And Dave Kapos, your view. I mean, waiving patent rights, say the WTO pass this deal next month or in December, what's it going to do to the landscape of COVID vaccine creation and manufacturing, in your view?
Yeah, Philip, I would tell you for sure, absolutely nothing. As has already been pointed out, the patent rights associated with COVID-19 have absolutely nothing to do with the challenges that we face in getting the world vaccinated. Those challenges are all about logistics and supply chains, and as Christina mentioned, refrigeration, and of course, not to mention lack of confidence in governments, governments that have issues with taking the medicines and moving them to places that they shouldn't be moved, and not giving access to the folks the citizens of their country who need to get vaccinated. Basically corruption related issues that result in lack of confidence of the citizenry in their governments, trained medical personnel, all the other things. There are many constraints and issues that need to be overcome, but none of them have anything to do with patents. And that's one of the things that's so sad about this debate, that it is such a distraction from focusing attention on the real issues, and instead placing and distracting our attention to a non-issue at a time when there's not the luxury of energy to waste on chasing non-issues. We need to focus on the things that really matter. And again, patents are not one of them in any way, shape, or form.
Thanks, Dave. And then turning to the politics of this a bit now. Sorry for our Canadian viewers. It's going to go a bit US-centric for a moment, but we'll come on to Mark Agnew for some more Canadian-specific perspective in a second. So the one certainty in global economic policy and politics is the United States will stand squarely behind the protection of intellectual property rights. At an international level, it's always been the champion at the World Trade Organization of robust protection of intellectual property rights, and has used its influence to shape the global intellectual property rights architecture. And yet, recently, I can't remember the exact month, was it late last year, the United States indicated that it would support this waiver, thereby sort of undoing a lot of its positioning on this issue over the last few decades. So Dave, I mean, why do you think the US has done this? And what do you think the impact will be on the final negotiations?
Yeah, well, great question, Philip. So that was actually earlier this year, and it was, a few months into the Biden administration when that announcement was made by new USTR Chief Catherine Tsai. And it caught all of us very much by surprise, who were trying to, help explain to the new administration that intellectual property has nothing to do with the challenges associated with COVID-19 vaccination. And indeed, pointing to and applauding the position taken by the EU, taken by the UK, and thank you, Philip, to the leadership in your country and throughout the EU in honestly recognizing that IP has absolutely nothing to do with our challenges. So why did the Biden administration take the approach they did? Frankly, I don't know for sure. I think that, and I give people credit in the administration for being as smart as all of we are and reading the same sources that we do. So I would expect that they knew and know that the U.S. potentially acceding to the waiver will not be effective. So my guess is they would have gone that direction anyway, as a matter of vaccine diplomacy and to show the world that the U.S. Is going to be a leader in helping people get vaccinated. I am, much more proud of what my country has done in actually, exporting doses and helping to accelerate the agreements and tech transfer that Mark and Christina have already referred to, which we all know is what will actually help solve the problem. So just to wrap up, I don't know why. I think it's probably because this is an issue that's complicated, not well understood by the general public. The administration would have thought, we don't want people distracted thinking IP is an issue. We know it's not an issue, but if people think it's an issue, let's just take that off the table. And okay, I see that logic.
Okay, and Christina, and then the same to Mark. Why, what's the US up to here? Can you add anything onto what Dave said?
I'm not sure what they're up to. I agree with Dave that we've got very smart people making these decisions. I think that the narrative that goes along with dismissing patents and increasing vaccine production is very attractive. And there's a simple story there that says that this is the barrier. And if we do away with patents, well, we've got a road to recovery and we're solving everything. And I think that there's something very pleasing about that, especially when it comes to quick little news bites and serving them up on social media. The reality of vaccine production is much more nuanced and complicated, and it's a much harder story to tell. And it's more difficult to advocate for protecting IP that comes out of the United States and is very valuable, and difficult to argue that that's not harming developing countries and preventing vaccines from getting into arms all over the world. I think it's a shortcut, and an unfortunate one that we seem to have taken.
Okay, thank you, Christina. And Mark, I know you chat to a lot of people up in Washington, DC. What are you hearing on this? Mark Shultz, yeah, apologies. You're on mute, Mark.
Terribly sorry. Well, I won't claim insider sources, but one thing I'll say is that many people in industry and the policy community I've talked to are concerned that the president doesn't have a strong IP policy team in place yet. We don't have a PTO director yet. I would not to sound obsequious, but I would try to draft Dave Kapos if I could into that role again. But we need somebody strong like Dave or Andre Iancu that understands the importance of IP rights to innovation, and the fact that the U.S. and the EU and other countries are concerned about global leadership and future technology. And some very important future technologies at stake here. mRNA vaccines are very promising. It's a platform, not just a single vaccine. It's an entire technological platform. And candidly, I think that some of the support at the WTO is among very savvy players who are engaging in realpolitik, who would like their own industries to have access to this technology and supplant the edge that European and US companies have. But moving to vaccinating the world, I think this is a bit of virtue signaling that the US is engaged in. And I think there may be some cynicism that the US thinks that when it gets into text-based negotiations, it can negate any harm because of how the waiver is drafted. But I think the eyes of the world are in the US, and they're not focused on what we're doing in Geneva. What the world understands most of all is that our government is considering giving boosters, third doses, or perhaps even beyond to healthy people. And the US CDC recommended yesterday that may not actually be the best path forward, that we may need to give boosters to people who are vulnerable. But I have a serious problem with the ethics of giving boosters to young, healthy people when there are very vulnerable people around the world who still need vaccines. I think it's time for developed countries to start to consider releasing manufacturers from their commitments to provide excess doses to the wealthiest countries and start to get those doses to the countries where they're needed most, for the populations where they're needed most. I think that would have a much greater impact and would make our country look better, and it would be the right thing to do.
Thanks, Mark. And the comment you made earlier about savvy realpolitik and countries using the waiver as a pretext to upgrade their own vaccine industries. I know in Korea, discussions are going on there to bolster their own. They want to become a regional vaccine manufacturing hub for mRNA vaccines, and I gather they're making overtures to the US to ensure the waiver goes ahead, so the the technology can be transferred because they don't currently have the capacity to do it themselves. So there's a lot going on at a political level. But turning back to Canada and Mark Agnew, so I'm unclear as to what Canada's position is on this waiver. What's your view on which way the government might go on this, and how do you think that might be influenced by the relatively slow vaccine rollout that's happened in Canada?
So, I mean, in terms of the politics here, I mean, in some ways, the debate around IP, I don't think is a unique one at a very macro level. I mean, rights holders tend to be on the back foot, whether you're talking about copyright, whether you're talking about pharmaceutical patents, and so those kind of overarching pieces are going, and certainly the opposition to TRIPS is not new. I mean, it just didn't get invented at the same time that COVID-19 started hitting the earth. So there is an opportunistic element, I think, for people who do have opposition to this sort of these things at a first principles level and wanting to use this as a means to advance those. To go down to the specifics of the Canadian dynamic, where our government is at right now, they had a sort of statement that had come out in the spring talking about willing to engage with any proposals and consider those, and that is the current position that we have. As many of the viewers would know, we're in the midst of a federal election at the moment. So whether we have the Liberal Party returning to power or whether there's a change in government remains to be seen, kind of what the impact will be. What I would say, though, just a little bit about some of the political dynamics, here, though, going back to my earlier point about effectively this being an issue of the heart that is a better soundbite over the kind of rationality of the mind. Our parliamentary trade committee in the spring did a study actually on the TRIPS waiver. And what was really interesting actually was in the spring when there was a petition going around from MPs calling for the TRIPS waiver to be granted. All but one of the trade committee members of parliament declined to sign on to that statement. And, I haven't gone and, asked them all individually what their reasoning was, but I would like to think that having sat through the committee, hearings, having heard from, industry, having heard from government representatives, that, those MPs, I think, had come to a realization about how thorny and how complicated this is. And I think, again, kudos to Mark Shultz for that, bang up summation that he gave earlier in the presentation, because that outlines, I think, succinctly and perfectly just how complicated the matter is. So there's those kind of things that are at play here. The other element too that our government's been spending a lot of time around is something called the Ottawa Group Trade and Health Initiative. And so the Ottawa Group, it wasn't formed again just for trade and health issues. It's been talking about a whole host of WTO matters. But they've also been putting forward some fairly tangible proposals in the health space, specifically to talk about measures like trade facilitation, regulatory cooperation, ensuring there's no export restrictions on either vaccines or inputs. And this is another thing that I think our government is trying to really pursue as a way forward to make demonstrable difference in helping with vaccine distribution around the world. The last thing I'll say is if you go and look at what's been put on the record in various WTO meetings in the TRIPS format, our government has been asking a lot of questions of the TRIPS waiver proponents and really trying to figure out, again, what is the problem that we're actually trying to address with the solution that you've put forward. So I don't want to be sort of putting words in the mouths of my government. I don't speak on behalf of my government, but I think the questions that they're asking, you can, I think, easily take away that there's a lot of unanswered questions about, what is it that we're actually going to achieve with the proposal that's been put forward.
Thank you, Mark. And while you're on this, I mean, as an outside observer, in Canada's, for all its other economic strengths, has struggled really to develop its own life science industry or innovative life science industry. If it were to, come down on the side of the waiver, which I'm not saying it will do, what would that mean for the Canadian ambitions in this direction and the economy more generally?
So, I mean, I'm sure that you and others listening to this will probably be aware of the fairly fraught relationship that the research-based pharmaceutical industry has had with the Canadian federal government over the years. This is sort of a longstanding set of issues, but we've seen recent manifestations, for instance, such as some of the tensions around the patent medicines price review board, issues and what's been going on there. And so I think if our government were to come out and sort of support a TRIPS waiver, I think that would certainly further strain the relationship that exists between the government and the industry. And I think to the government's credit, before the election, there certainly had been work to help rebuild, that relationship. There had been a life sciences strategy that had been tabled just in advance of the, election call. So certainly there have been efforts that have been, made to start to rebuild a domestic biomanufacturing, capacity. But if you're going to rebuild domestic biomanufacturing capacity, at the heart of that is a strong life sciences strategy.
And Christina, same point to you. How will this play out for Canada's economy if the country comes down on the side of the waiver and ends up utilizing the provisions that would be in there?
Thank you. I think that Mark's got it exactly right. I think that the reason that Canada doesn't currently have a strong life sciences sector is because there have been some egregious gaps in their IP protections for the biopharmaceutical industry. I think that historically things such as the promise doctrine have gotten in the way of tremendous investment and confidence in the Canadian system. The lack of enforcement for medicine patents has been an issue. And I think that this would just be another nail in the coffin, that it would be a further step that we can't have confidence in the Canadian investment in biopharmaceutical technologies and industries, and there would be greater hesitation to move forward and develop such a domestic industry.
Okay, thank you. And then Dave Kapos, I wanted to turn back again to the international politics, having discussed what it means for Canada. So I think there's a sort of an emerging consensus that this waiver is going to be impractical to implement and probably won't accelerate the end of the pandemic, given that there are many billions of doses currently being manufactured and many more billions going to be manufactured by early next year. So the question I have for you is, what are the motivations of the countries that have put this forward, India, South Africa in particular? Some have said that part of the objective of this waiver is not really about COVID. It's more about putting a marker down, sending a signal, and trying eventually to roll back the TRIPS agreement so that intellectual property is not so strongly protected at an international level. Do you buy that? Do you think there's anything in that?
Yeah, a lot of us have speculated over what the motivations are, and Philip, that's one I've heard. Maybe I wouldn't surprise me as the debate over TRIPS waivers goes back generations, and this would be viewed as an opportunity to further whittle away at TRIPS and set precedent for waivers. I think, though, I go back to a comment that Mark made earlier, and I'll put a little finer point on it. mRNA is a platform. It is a powerful platform, and it represents breakthrough intellectual property, much of it protected by trade secret, some of it protected by patent. For countries that have strong generics industries, which, by the way, I fully support, and will say the Indian generics industry, the South African generics industry are brilliant. They've done a great job. I have no inherent issue with them. But if you're in the generics industry, and you can get access to the mRNA platform, that is a huge opportunity and a huge leap, because once you understand and can exploit that platform, you then can cost effectively cross over and put new treatments, vaccines in the marketplace for the next pandemic, the next drug that's needed of that kind. And so that's a theory that I've heard, and it somewhat resonates with me, that there's a strategic objective to gain access to the mRNA platform and thereby leapfrog into the future of vaccine research, development, and production.
And thank you, Dave. Mark Shultz, I mean, you've been involved in the debate around access to medicines and the TRIPS agreement, what it means for developing countries for some time. What's your view on the future of the TRIPS agreement and whether or not this is an attack on its fundamentals?
I think, unfortunately, it is an attack on its fundamentals. There's been discontent with the TRIPS framework for a long time, partly because it was actually effective. It has an enforcement mechanism, and that enforcement mechanism allows, within the context of the WTO, allows countries to hold each other to account. By the way, the US has been held to account as well. And that's really different from previous IP treaties. And so having to actually, meet minimum standards, actually being accountable, has often chafed. And there's a strong ideological component that's extremely skeptical of IP within academia, parts of civil society. And so as Dave noted, the discontent with TRIPS has been longstanding. And those of us who've been involved in the debate a long time recognize that the arguments we've heard are very familiar arguments. They didn't come up in the past 18 months. Unlike the mRNA vaccines and other treatments, they're not novel, they're not cutting edge, they're not brand new, they're decades old. And they're just being repurposed for this debate as an opportunity, I think. And I know I've found that proponents are often more interested in their viewpoint than they are in the facts on the ground. So Philip and I have been involved in this discussion for well over a year, since I guess late February of 2020. And the story we've heard was that IP was going to stop the necessary collaboration and knowledge transfer to begin the research to fight the pandemic. That wasn't true. That collaboration did occur, and there was a lot of open science and sharing of knowledge at that point. Then we heard it was going to get in the way of developing the vaccines. That wasn't the case. Vaccines were developed in record time, many different vaccines, some using parallel technology, some using different technology. And now the story is that IP will get in the way of collaboration and manufacturing. And that's not happening either. So people have these ready-made, pre-purposed arguments that they pull out, and yet they tend to ignore the facts on the ground. And I'm finding that when I talk to other academics who've been writing papers on this and advising NGOs and advising some of the governments who are proponents of the waiver. And they're much more focused on interpreting the treaty and developing arguments for why a waiver would be in accord with TRIPS. And yet what I'm finding is they're not as aware of the facts on the ground. They're surprised at many of the things I've told people about in this webinar about how much collaboration is going on. I think there's an assumption that these things would never happen, that the companies want to hoard IP and raise prices, and because that's sort of the caricature that fits some of the presuppositions. And instead, what we've seen is global collaboration. And so it's time to put aside the ideology and focus on some of the issues that we really need to focus on: logistics, getting shots in arms, and combating vaccine nationalism, so that there is greater sharing of the doses that are being produced.
Thanks, Mark. That brings me neatly onto my next question. So we've discussed the role of intellectual property rights in vaccine innovation and how it's important for collaboration and manufacturing. And yes, there do seem to be many billions of doses being manufactured rapidly. And yet, many, particularly in developing countries, are not yet vaccinated. Some countries have very low rates. And I think we'll all agree that the global problem will not be solved until all countries that have achieved high levels of vaccination. So given that the WTO waiver doesn't look like, even if it were implemented, that it's going to solve the problem, What could the international community do instead? What do you think would be an effective use of international resources or governance to make sure that developing countries have access to vaccines more rapidly? I'll put that one to Dave first.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So effective use of international resources, it's got to be on helping to further increase production of the vaccine. As has already been mentioned, there are billions of doses now being produced, but we need even more. And then I would say more so helping with the logistics, moving the vaccines to developing and lesser developed countries, and providing the assistance, the trained medical personnel, the follow-up, which hasn't been mentioned before. As we all know, most of these vaccines have a 2-dose regimen, and require follow-up, providing the skilled support and the follow-up to make sure that everything that needs to get done actually does get done for patients. Those are the problems that we need to focus on, and where the international community needs to pool its resources. And again, I congratulate and thank the EU for the leadership in that regard and pointing out those things that really do need to have international attention.
Christina Ackery, what do you think should be done to improve access to vaccines beyond a waiver?
I think that one of the most important issues that we can think about in terms of access is the number of doses that are going to waste. And it's not as simple as just picking them up, putting them on a plane, and sending them to another country so they can be used. This is complicated technology that requires careful handling. And I think if we could invest in some of the capacity for distribution and getting these shots into arms with trained personnel, as mentioned before, doing away with corruption, making sure that refrigerated transport is available, I think that doses could be more easily moved from one place to another and used before expiration. I think that's key. I think that it's also important to recognize that IP has given us competing vaccines that give us a variety of technologies that we can use and implement, and that competition is healthy, and it enables multiple companies to have the incentives to develop these things, which increases the availability. And availability and different technologies is one of the steps that we need to take in order to make sure that doses are available, that access is plentiful, and that everyone from all corners of the earth is able to get shots in their arms.
Thanks, Christina. And Mark Shultz, describing COVID as a commercial opportunity, is that distasteful, or do you think it's been useful for speeding up access to drug, or creating these vaccines in the first place? If surely in a pandemic there should be no commercial considerations, or do you think that the fact there's money to be made has helped the situation?
Oh, that's a complicated question in some ways. I think, stock market analysts, chief financial officers, and CEOs, they have to worry about these issues. They have investors who follow these issues, and or some of the companies that aren't public have private investors. I've had an opportunity over the past several months, though, to talk to well over a dozen manufacturing and IP experts from these companies. And what you find is that, probably contrary to some stereotypes, is these folks are in this business because they have a passion for great science and applying great science to deliver cures to patients. And yes, they have to do it in a way that makes money, and people have to mind that, because if they don't mind that, then the investment won't be there. And it's not because the people won't leave this sector out of spite. I think when the next pandemic happens, regardless of what we do with the waiver, the biopharma industry will try to step up. The question is, will they have the resources to do so? What happens, innovation in the sector tends to start with small companies like like Moderna and BioNTech once were. They were startups. They received billions in investment. And those investors make a choice. Those investors know their money's at risk, that in the biopharma sector, most startups fail, most potential treatments fail, but they're willing to accept that risk because there are rewards. If the prospect of success becomes a penalty, because success means you've developed something people need that governments will take away, that makes investing in this sector much less tolerable, much more risky. If investors have to account for political risk, they may not fund the next Moderna. They may not fund the next BioNTech. There are other places to put your money, safer things like food and beverage or lifestyle brands. And when you make those relatively more attractive, that's where the money goes. It's not a matter of spite. In fact, sometimes, some of these investors are institutional investors who are investing people's pension funds. Do you want your pension fund invested in something that's likely to be expropriated? No. So we have to understand that there are consequences. And when we change the incentives, behavior changes not out of spite, but out of caution. So we may have a less productive biopharma sector with fewer resources and fewer innovators if we don't respect the commercial incentives and the demands of investors and other stakeholders, people who work for these companies. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. And Mark Agnew, you mentioned a bit earlier on some of the work being done at the international level by Canada to address some of the non-intellectual property barriers to distribution and manufacturing. Can you tell us a bit more, or describe a bit more about what they actually are? Are they trade-related things, or are there blockages that are stopping files flowing from country to country?
So there's a number of things that are part of that initiative. For instance, on the export restriction side, this is something that we had dealt with in the early days of the sort of vaccine distribution world when we got there, in terms of the EU putting up various barriers. And certainly, I know the Auto Group was focused on ensuring that both the EU walked back from those measures, as well as not having them proliferate in other markets. Picking up on a point that David made around logistics and distribution, we're in this panel very fortunate to be living in the developed world, where I know Philip, it's a little different for you, but for us in North America, a 120 volt socket, I can plug a fridge in, and I can put my vials in there, and they can sit there until need be. There's a lot of people that are in that fortunate circumstance. So what are we doing in terms of logistics to get ready to ensure there's electricity and that there's the ability to refrigerate these products once they reach those areas? Because it's not going to necessarily be they get sort of rolled off the truck and then immediately put into people's arms. They do have to be stored at some point. Then there's of course also the issue around customs and import clearance procedures. We know again from even in the developed world, these things can be a little rocky at times, of things being held up at the border. And what we should be doing is ensuring that all of the customs and clearance processes are going to be as flowing as seamlessly as possible, in those markets. And so again, this is another example of where the Ottawa Group as a sort of coordinating body within the WTO can help to drive forward some of these trade facilitation initiatives that would again expedite the process that much more. Where certainly every day counts with getting more people vaccinated.
Thanks, Mark. And then touching on what Mark Shultz said earlier on, obviously the US is moving on to booster doses, as the UK has just announced that it is also going to start a booster program for the over 50s in the autumn. So this is not unique to Canada, but Canada is notable in that it ordered the most number of doses per head of population in the world, I believe. I stand to be corrected, but I think that's the case. 12 doses per head of population, according to my notes. And now that you Canadians are approaching universal or full vaccination for COVID, what do you think should be done with the surplus? Should you be holding them back for the future, or should you be doing something else with them? And Mark Agnew.
The simple answer is donate them. I don't know the ins and outs of what's actually in these contracts. I would assume that if they're not already having clauses in there that would allow diversion to other markets, that we should be talking about how best to do that and doing it in a timely manner. We don't need 12 doses of vaccine per person. That's just sort of a matter of sort of fact. That's there's nothing really up for debate about that point. And certainly, as we're talking about how Canada can actually do some good on the world stage and how we can make a difference. This is a good example of taking those surplus doses that would just be otherwise sitting in here, given where we are, to have a fairly high vaccination rate and be donating to the countries that need them most.
And Christina, I know you're not Canadian. And Mark Shultz, I'll come to you next. Christina, boost or hold for the future for the US? I know there's a lot of people in the US in certain states have not yet been vaccinated. What's the answer in your view?
I think if it's a question of giving boosters to people who are already fully vaccinated, that the objective should be to get those doses into other arms, whether they are the unvaccinated within the US or whether they are in other countries, and we can donate them. We are clearly struggling to get the unvaccinated to take a couple of jabs. So I think that it seems more reasonable that those doses should be donated. Holding back the ones that are needed for vulnerable populations who need the extra protection as we enter into influenza season. And then beyond that, moving to vaccinate the rest of the world.
Okay, thanks, Christine. And Mark Shultz, I saw you had your hand stuck up there. Any perspectives on this from the US?
Yes, I think there are two sides to this. Why did Canada end up with 12 doses per person committed? Were they being greedy? No, not at all. There was a crucial role that governments played in making pre-orders, because they committed to purchase vaccines so long as they succeeded, so long as they were approved for distribution. And that way, that de-risked manufacturers from the challenge that they could develop an efficacious vaccine that was simply not preferred for some reason. So they could have invested billions, but not had a market, not because it didn't work, but because there was a preference for whatever reason. And so governments put lots of bets down, and that helped us get to where we are, that there were so many competing vaccine manufacturers. And we had really unexpected success. Nobody thought we would succeed at this rate with so many different technologies, with so many different companies. And there's more coming online. That's exciting. But it means that some countries now have commitments for more vaccines than they necessarily need. And now we need to decide what to do with those commitments. And it's important to understand that these are contractual commitments that the manufacturers are obligated to fulfill. So in the last 2 weeks or so, last few weeks, a controversy arose. And for some reason, Johnson & Johnson was painted as the villain in this controversy. The fill and finish part of vaccine production for some of the J&J vaccines was being done in South Africa by a company called Aspen. That means they were taking the vaccine, putting it into vials, labeling them, capping them, and shipping them. Now, the doses were, the European Union had priority on these doses. And it was a rather ghoulish scenario where to ship vaccine doses out of Africa, where only 3% of people are vaccinated, to the EU. And pressure was initially put on Johnson & Johnson. Activists blamed Johnson & Johnson, which was fulfilling its contractual commitments. The key thing that happened here was the EU released Johnson & Johnson from its contractual commitments so that the vaccines could be produced for Africa, that the vaccines filled and finished in South Africa would stay in Africa, and the EU committed to providing 200 million doses to Africa by the end of the year. This was a great outcome. And the important thing for people to understand is this has to happen before the vaccines are filled and finished and labeled. Once they're in a country at the end of the production chain, they have been purposed for that country. I mean, think of it like, just look at a beverage can or food product that's labeled for your country and it meets regulatory requirements for your country. Well, those regulatory requirements are even more stringent for medicines. So you can't donate them after the fact. Countries have to step up and release manufacturers from their contractual commitments, so those doses can be prepared to be delivered to African nations and to other least developed countries, to the populations that are most vulnerable. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. We are coming towards the end of the webinar. It's been very interesting. Lots of great perspectives on this quite tricky issue. It's quite a technical issue, so it's great that we have people here able to put it into plain English and help us non-technical people understand a bit better the difficulties that are faced by us. So perhaps this is a good opportunity to ask people to kind of put their argument into a nutshell and to sum up their views on the issue. Tricky, I know, in a few sentences, but Christina Acri, will waiving intellectual property rights for COVID vaccines help or hinder, in your view?
In my opinion, it will definitely hinder. I think that it's the wrong way to get to the solution that we want, which is to see everyone in the world vaccinated. I think we have evidence that IP rights are an essential piece of that puzzle, and that we need to shore them up rather than tear them down. I think that our efforts instead should go to voluntary licensing. We know that that has worked in the past. When it comes to hepatitis C or HIV, this has been something that has been shown to be successful. And beyond that, I think that we need to look at investing in capacity. So making sure that when the vaccines are ready, that they can be distributed, that they can be put into the arms that need them. Thank you.
Very concise, thank you. And Mark Agnew, your tuppence, as we say in England, on this issue.
Well, I mean, to sort of clarify the thing that I bungled at the very beginning of the presentation, our view is very much this is a solution in search of a problem for all the reasons that we've spent the last, hour and 15 minutes, talking about. There's existing mechanisms. There's the Article 31. If we want to, find ways for this to somehow work, voluntary arrangements are already happening in any event. I think we should support those, continue to make those happen, figure out how to get the supply chain working, whether it's raw inputs or that last mile delivery, element. And again, let's not be distracted by this issue when, we need to be focusing on, getting shots into arms as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Mark. And Mark Shultz.
If this pandemic had happened 10 years ago, we wouldn't have the vaccines we have now. We have those vaccines because of tremendous investment and innovation. It mostly starts with great science, great basic research, often funded by governments, but then billions and billions more poured into applied research. And we're fortunate that just about when that technology was ready to go, the pandemic hit. But that technology would not have existed without the institutions we have. So we need to respect those institutions going forward. I think we actually owe an ethical obligation to future generations to maintain the institutions we have and try to improve them. Yes, we need to lower trade barriers. We need to talk about governments cooperating in global procurement and building manufacturing capacity in preparation for future emergencies. But ultimately, it is the system we have that delivered these vaccines, and I don't think another system could have done it, and that's a story for another day. But we're really fortunate that we had the institutions we had that delivered what we have so far. Let's just get those doses into everybody's arms as soon as we can. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. And Dave Kapos, I'll give you the honor of having the last word on this. IP waiver, help or hindrance?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. An IP waiver will be a huge hindrance, unfortunately, to reaching the end of the pandemic. Look, we're in a terrible situation. We all feel horribly about so many of our fellow human beings perishing through this pandemic. We all want solutions for everyone on the planet. We need to honestly confront that intellectual property is not the problem. We need to move on and work on the real problems, logistics, supply chains, all the things that we've discussed here, getting agreements in place. And that's what's going to solve this pandemic. And it's respect for intellectual property, championing the TRIPS system as a solution, not a problem, that is going to enable us to confront what is inevitably the next pandemic. So if you think both short term and long term, you have to come to the conclusion that waiving the TRIPS requirements is not going to solve this pandemic, but what it would do is disable our important biopharma industry from being in a position to address the next pandemic.
Thank you, Dave. Nicely put. So that ends the webinar. It's been an illuminating discussion, lots of interesting perspectives from the private sector, from academia, from the former government, I suppose, not current government. We should be clear on that. And I would urge everyone who's interested in this issue to go to the Geneva Network website, where you'll find interesting opinion articles and more substantive academic research on this topic for those who want to dive in a bit deeper. So this just remains for me to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for putting this on, for their excellent organisation, and to our panellists, Dave Kapos, Mark Agnew, Mark Shultz, and Christina Acri. You've been wonderful panelists, and I very much enjoyed it. And I thank everyone for tuning in, and hopefully we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much, and goodbye.